Hi, welcome to Unit 5 of ESLG 489. And what we're up to in this unit is to explore yet another group of cultural backgrounds that I've decided to call Slavic. And I've taken this term from an interview that I did with Yelena in this unit, in which she suggests that that's a good word to use to kind of describe the cultural backgrounds of those who are originally from what we call the former USSR. So this unit focuses around an interview that I did. It's quite long. It's in two parts. A long interview that I did with Stan and Yelena. They're a married couple. They both moved to the U.S. At different times, at different ages, and they're now settled and they have children. And as you listen to their stories, I think that you will hear some very important differences. One difference that comes up right away is the difference in age on arrival. So Stan arrived when he was age 4, and Yelena arrived, she was still young, but she was in 5th grade. And connected with age, you will also hear that the amount of education they experienced in their first language is also very different. So for Stan, he began preschool before he left Estonia, but then began his real formal education in the U.S. entirely in English. Yelena had a start to her education, so you'll hear that she was beginning to build up her CALP in her first language. So she left her country, Ukraine, in 5th grade. So she had quite a bit of learning and of mastering the academic ways of thinking and writing and reading that you do. So those will come up. Another thing that you'll hear is that they experienced differences in the size of the L1 first language community. They both arrived in Moses Lake at different times. And when Stan arrived, there were very few Russian or Ukrainian speakers. And when Yelena arrived, there were quite a few. So you'll hear that play a role in the story. And finally, another thing that you'll hear is that Yelena was obviously a gifted learner. As she's telling her story about how she, on her own, was learning English, I think you'll recognize it doesn't sound like a typical language learner. There are some signs that she was learning faster and she was learning more effectively and more independently than students usually do. And that is a sign of giftedness. So after you listen to the interviews and kind of absorb the stories that Stan and Yelena share with us, we're going to move into two different kinds of texts afterwards that you'll either watch or listen to or read. The first part, the first set of texts are very much at the surface level. And in part, I want you to recognize that there are some very simple ways that you can go about carrying out a web search about a new cultural background or students coming from a homeland that you know very little about. Often I hear teachers say that they don't have the time to research a student's background. And what I want you to know is I spent very few minutes finding some information that I provide in the first part after the interviews. And it's there, I think it'll be helpful, but it's also there to act as kind of a landmark for you of the kinds of things that you could look at. So, for example, one of the things that you will probably want to do if you have some newly arrived refugees or immigrants in your classroom is to learn about why are they here? In other words, what caused them to leave their home country? And I find that a really great place to turn for some really quick information that I haven't yet found to be inaccurate is to turn to YouTube to people who do vlogs and who talk about current political situations, also by referring back to history and kind of the cultural context. So for you, what I've done is I found a YouTube channel by the Vlog Brothers that has an episode devoted to Ukraine. And so I mentioned in our module, hold on to your hats, because if you haven't seen these two brothers, they're quite frenetic. And so it's a really quick overview. If you struggle still with listening to really fast English, you might have to listen a couple of times. But it's a good model for us of how we can spend very little time and start to understand some of the historical and current struggles that might be part of the reason, at least, that students are arriving in the U.S. So that's where we start. The next place we go is to understand pragmatics a little bit. Now, Stan and Yelena talk little, if any, about pragmatics. And remember, pragmatics means politeness, how we show politeness to each other, and that means both things that we can say, things we can't say, ways we touch or don't touch, things like that. So here's something for you to think about. When you have a group of students that you're working with and you want to understand more about the pragmatics, one thing you can do is to ask yourself, for people from the United States traveling to this country or having some kind of interaction with students from this country, who would need to know about pragmatics, who is that group? So, for example, for those countries that there has traditionally been a very strong international adoption relationship with between the U.S. and that country, for parents who are going overseas to adopt a child, that means they need to spend a couple of weeks at least in the country. And since they want something, they want to be seen as acceptable parents for a child, that means that they want to be seen as polite. So for countries and cultural backgrounds such as that, you'll be able to find information, websites, even videos telling prospective parents how to be polite in this culture. Or if there's a really strong business relationship between the country and U.S., for example, Japan and the U.S., you will think about who would need to know information about how to be polite. People doing business in Japan. So there are lots of online videos and websites and even blogs looking at how to be polite in business in Japan. So I suggest that you kind of approach this from that alternative standpoint to find pragmatics information by thinking about who needs this information. So what I did was I thought about, around the pragmatics of the Slavic world, I thought about who wants to appear polite in, say, Ukraine. And you probably know there's a big business of men from the U.S. traveling to Ukraine to find a wife. And so it is a huge business. There are actually documentaries about it on YouTube. But at any rate, if you're traveling to Ukraine to meet what you hope will be your wife, you certainly want to be polite. So I found a young woman who has produced a series of videos about pragmatics in Ukraine, and that is exactly who her audience is. But it works for us too. So there's part 1 and part 2. If you don't want to listen to her little advertisement of that she's created this for men traveling to Ukraine, just don't listen to the end of the second video. And I have that time written down in our modules. Another thing that you'll probably want to think about, and I think the younger the student that you're working with, the more that you need to think about this, is the writing system and the spoken language, the pronunciation of the first language of the students. And I have found that 2 websites, Wikipedia, looking at languages, so looking up, for example, the name of the language in Wikipedia, and going to the website omniglot.com, omniglot.com. Those are excellent resources, as well as you can often find YouTube videos, and they're meant for people like you or me who wish to learn a little bit of the language. And so you'll find videos teaching you the alphabet, or teaching you the basic writing system, or teaching you some basic words, or how to greet each other, that kind of thing. And so they are excellent resources. What I've done for you, because Ukraine, the Ukrainian language and the Russian language both use the Cyrillic alphabet, is I've included a video that of the Cyrillic alphabet that shows you how it's written and what it sounds like, and also gives you a sample word so that you can kind of experience that. And maybe just for a few minutes experience what life must have been like for Stan and Yelena as they were first experiencing the English alphabet, and how overwhelming that probably was, at least temporarily. So those first pieces, those are really just at the more shallow level, but they matter. And just as I said, it took me very little time to find those things. And so I hope when I run into you in the future that that's never in your repertoire to say, I just don't have time to explore a student's background, the pragmatics, the language, how the language is written, the historical situation, because it really doesn't take much time at all. So the real issues that come up in that interview with Stan and Yelena, the first thing that I look at is what we have realized for about probably as many as 10 years, but at least definitely the last 5, is a big problem with English language learners in the K-12 system in the U.S. And that is, in general, we do not recognize when students are gifted and talented when they're English language learners. So the types of evidence that teachers are looking for that a student is gifted and talented, often language development and cultural background can often get in the way. So for example, if a student is from a cultural background in which they are expected to be silent in class unless they were specifically called on, they're going to be pretty quiet, and the teacher's not going to recognize that they actually have a deep understanding already of what's going on. And even those gifted and talented assessments that are nonverbal, they're cultural, and culture gets in the way of students being able to express that. So what I've done is I've found kind of a nifty handbook that was created for a state, and you don't need to read all of it. I mean, feel free to if you want to. But really for our purposes, just take a look at pages 9 through 19. And it'll give you a sense of what the problem is. And it begins to look at that at the end, in those end pages, at maybe where the solution is as well. So the fact that Yelena was gifted and talented is really something for us to think about and to recognize that that does exist. And we are more likely than not to miss it in our English language learners. So it should be on all of our radar. The next 2 articles that I'll have you take a look at are really around, they have to do with the age of arrival, the age at which a student begins their education in the U.S. in English. And I'm sure that you're already from our second language acquisition course, if you're in that as well, or you've taken that previously, and from your own thinking about this, you're probably starting to really recognize it is a powerful background for a student to begin learning in the U.S. educational system when they've already built up a lot of academic language. They've already built up a lot of intellectual resources in their minds, strategies, how to compare and contrast, how to think through a problem, how to problem solve, that kind of thing. And so the next 2 articles that you'll take a look at are looking at what are students facing when they're either born in the U.S. and all of their experience with schooling is in English, or they're born elsewhere but most of their education is in the U.S. in English. And so take a look at those and really kind of let that absorb in, especially because these are counterintuitive. If you were to talk with your family or with your friends, with your roommate, with your spouse, and talk to them about whether or not they thought it would be better for a student to arrive earlier rather than later in their education in the U.S., rather than completing more of their education in their first language in their first country. I'm sure that they would believe that the sooner a student arrives in the U.S., and better even that they're born in the U.S., the better off they would be. But that's not what statistics tell us. And if we think about second language acquisition and how we build up understanding of language, I think that starts to make sense. The final issue that we look at in this unit is a really sensitive one, and this has to do with the relationship between children and parents when they immigrate to the U.S. And specifically, the article that I've chosen for you to take a look at is when children translate for parents. So one of the things that you'll hear with Stan and Yelena is that often, and for good reason, children have more access often to education, they're often more motivated by playmates, etc., to learn English. And so often children are out ahead of parents in terms of the amount of English that they have access to. And what usually happens when a family moves to the U.S. in this situation where the parents have less access to English than the children is that the relationship between parents and children flips. And this is one of the greatest heartbreaks for a lot of parents who move to the U.S. And so it's something that we'll continue to take a look at in this course, but for now, let's just focus on what happens when children translate for parents. So take your time, explore these issues, think about them, and then I'll meet you in the discussion. And as always, even before you're truly ready to kind of make your real posting in the discussion, feel free to post some questions that are occurring to you. Or if you come up against a concept that doesn't quite make sense or you don't quite get, feel free to post on that, and I can help you with that as well. I hope you enjoy the unit.